Welcome to the chaos sector. I guess we should get prepared for the trial in the Idaho murders case. The closer we get to the trial, the more so-called evidence is coming out. None of it came out last year though? That's odd. We look to News Nation, who has lost its credibility in regards to this case. For that matter, all mainstream media. And here is another example. Apparently, Kohberger had committed a prior crime involving a female he knew. Let's just jump right in and give our thoughts.
And now to the Idaho murders case. Suspected killer Brian Kohberger is set to be arraigned on Monday morning at 9 a.m. This comes after a grand jury indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder on Tuesday. And now we are learning more about the suspects from Kohberger's own family, along with another bombshell allegation claiming the suspect, Brian Kohberger, was involved in another crime that happened before these murders. Now, this incident involved his female co-worker at Washington State University. According to a Dateline report, someone allegedly broke into the woman's apartment and moved things around. Instead of calling police, the co-worker called Kohberger, who suggested and helped her install security cameras. But the report says Kohberger was behind that break-in and used those cameras to spy on her. Let's bring in now News Nation national security contributor.
Nope, you're not going to just slide away from that. First of all, why didn't the female call the cops if someone broke into her home? For some eerie reason, people aren't calling the cops in dangerous predicaments. Guess it's the Mortensen effect. Second, if Kohberger was the one who broke into her home and spied on her, where's the arrest record of this home invasion? Remember, this reporter claimed they discovered it was Kohberger behind it all, who had broken into the home and cunningly installed cameras to spy on the female. Oh wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. It should be explained in this segment. Let's find out, shall we?
Former CIA officer and FBI special agent Tracy Walder. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Always great to see you. So first, let's start with this new allegation, which claims Kohberger broke into his female colleague's home and how he used this incident to spy on her. What does this claim tell you about Kohberger himself?
So, look, we have to take all of these as just claims, right? We don't necessarily have multiple sources, reporting that this is true.
Thanks for establishing that point, to tone down the suggestive propaganda of News Nation. They have always presented claims, from so-called sources, yet no actual proof of any of it. They did it with the stalking claim, and now they're claiming another source has proof Kohberger committed a prior crime. Before you report that a so-called source has proof of something, how about checking the credibility of their claim before reporting it? Not gonna happen, they are too deep in pushing the narrative. But what do you expect with corrupt media?
If this is true, and if this indeed happened, it really does point to his sort of pattern of stalking. I have always believed, it's just my personal opinion, that, the victims in the Idaho Kings Road house were not randomly selected. I do believe that in some way he stalked them, whether that was digitally or physically, we don't know. And so what this could point to is a pattern of stalking in that he was surveilling this person remotely or in some kind of digital way. So that's what this would help point to.
Now, at least that was a fair assessment of Kohberger. Even though she believes Kohberger murdered those students, that is her belief. And in belief, not facts, her analysis never claims something to be fact, like News Nation often does. That can get you into trouble, claiming something is fact, without any proof. Her belief that Kohberger murdered those students is of course accompanied by her theory as to his motive. That's understandable. The so-called evidence can present that belief. But let's turn our attention to that very Dateline. They are the ones who threw that out there. We got what we needed out of this segment. The news about Kohberger's sister suspecting him of murdering those students means nothing. It's not evidence, it's only used to somehow convince the public that he is guilty, because his sister thinks he is. Now I draw your attention to the trail of misinformation, more importantly, disinformation, regarding this allegation. News Nation reports that Kohberger had committed a crime prior, involving a female friend, right? He had broken into her home, shuffled things around, and then advised that female to install a surveillance system in the home. And through this, he somehow would remotely observe her in that home, right? Okay, this is the setting. But, what investigative method was used to find out it was Kohberger responsible for the criminal activity? We can only suggest the authorities had to be notified. And if the authorities were involved, Kohberger would be arrested for this crime. It is a home invasion, which could be a felony charge depending on the state. Was Kohberger teaching his female friend a lesson in security, where he had broken into her home, then advised her to install surveillance cameras? Don't think so, because the female friend never claimed Koberger had taught her a lesson about security in her home. So Koberger would be stalking her, invaded her home, then pretended to show concern by advising her to install surveillance cameras, only so he could observe her inside the home by way of having access to her security system? There are tons of criminal charges here, and yet none of them were ever presented. Conspiracy, home invasion, stalking, and considering those crimes, we can assume he planned on attacking her in some way, either sexually or even fatally. Are you understanding this setting? I'm sure you do. Now if this isn't enough to boggle your brain, let's go even further. Dateline, which is the so-called source of this information, never presented the actual female who was friends with Koberger. No interview of that female friend, which they could have easily done, masking her identity and her voice. Wouldn't this be a vital witness, who had first-hand experiences with the suspect? Yes. We often see this, where witnesses, or associates, request their identity be concealed in interviews. If that was presented, we can at least suggest this as evidence. But this was not produced in that episode. Rather, they claim that a source informed them about this so-called incident. Let's briefly examine it, with captions, due to the clever tactic of NBC protecting that episode from being obtained on their YouTube channel. We had to go to the website and view this episode, and literally screen record just to display that particular segment. Bear with us for a moment. If you examine, this individual claims that sources tell NBC that this occurred. Now who in the flying fudge is this source? I need you to really think about this, because this is very dangerous territory. A source has to be some sort of investigator or detective. But remember, the female didn't call the cops, right? So, during this time frame, which was before the Idaho murders, what source during that time discovered that it was Koberger who had broken into her home? Was it a neighbor? Well, why didn't the neighbor call the cops? You see, if we were to suggest that the source was not associated with law enforcement, they would have notified that very law enforcement about a break-in. And why wouldn't the friend call the authorities, once she realized her home had been broken into? It doesn't matter that nothing was stolen, someone was snooping around in your home. Would you feel safe at night, knowing someone had been in your home? Of course not, which means she would have called the authorities, and reported that home invasion. But, somehow, she just brushed it off, like her life was not in potential danger. Who behaves like this? Nobody behaves like this, only fictional people. Heck, even fictional characters in movies would call the authorities. So let me get this straight, since there wasn't anything stolen, she felt it wasn't worth notifying the authorities. Are we to suggest that this female was not concerned about her safety? It appears so, right? Coming home, seeing that it had been broken into, especially a single female, should frighten her. The only concern she showed was notifying none other than Koberger about the incident. Despite his advice in installing security cameras, the authorities would have been called before anything else. What is it with individuals surrounding Koberger to where they don't have the instinct to call the authorities? Mortensen literally observed him walk right past her and leave the home, and didn't call the authorities. In this so-called incident, the female friend doesn't call the authorities when her home was broken into, and, at some point it was discovered Koberger was the perpetrator, she still doesn't call the authorities. You want to know why the authorities were never called in these scenarios? Because it actually compromises a huge portion of the very incidents themselves. Would she have called the authorities if something was taken? Knowing how derp the story is, yeah. But that would paint her as being more concerned about material possessions, rather than her literal safety in her home. That's bonkers, but this is how I conclude it all. So you are going to, quote, handle the situation on your own, despite the risk of being attacked by the home invader? What if you are asleep, and the home invader enters your home, and sexually assaults you, tortures you in your home, kidnaps you, and ultimately murders you? But hey, it's not that important, because nothing was stolen out of the home. If someone is rummaging through your home, they also have the potential to harm you if they encountered you there. But what do I know? I'm just using common sense here. This is bonkers. Let's try to continue, because my brain cells are deteriorating. Warning, this is fake news. But it's all jumbled up, because it's a freaking, no, I'll just use profanity this time, it's a fucking lie. Picture the scenario. First, Kohberger breaks into the home, the friend looks to him for help, he advises her to get a surveillance system, which he would apparently install, then, he sits back and observes her remotely via Wi-Fi password. Okay, well, how did he get caught? He didn't get caught, because it never fucking happened. He would have been arrested without a doubt. And like mentioned, if this had happened, coincidentally, the Idaho murders, which he is the alleged killer, wouldn't have happened. So, he doesn't get arrested for a previous crime of home invasion and stalking, the same fucking crimes he committed in the Idaho murders, and with those previous crimes not punished, allowed him to commit the Idaho murders. Can anyone make sense of this? Why even try? I'm starting to lose patience, because I do not like deception. Dateline pushed that narrative, cunningly hiding that episode on their website, then News Nation regurgitates that very claim, on their YouTube platform, presenting it as fact, just like the source they obtained it from. And yet, nobody fact-checks these media outlets? Think again, we just did it. The reason Dateline claimed the female friend didn't call the cops, is to justify no arrest of Kohberger. But they fall on their faces horribly, because you can't have a scenario where a so-called source discovers it was Kohberger who committed a fucking crime, and not have him arrested for home invasion. This would create an arrest record, which never existed. I'm done, I just can't finish this. I leave it to my colleagues. I told everyone early on, this is just more evidence Kohberger is being framed.
Patience, buddy, we have to keep our composure with this one. Wow, that is unbelievable. No wonder they never uploaded that full episode on YouTube, too many holes in their so-called journalism. This is getting out of hand, ironically around the time a man's life is being threatened in court. For Dateline to claim that a source informed them about this alleged incident means someone had previously investigated this crime where Kohberger had been identified as the perpetrator. But it wasn't a mere mishap, such as running a stop sign, right? It was someone breaking into a home, which is home invasion, pretending to be of assistance to the victim only to gain access to their security system they themselves had installed after the break-in, which they were responsible for. But no charge against Brian Kohberger for home invasion? He basically was stalking that female, in which he was a potential threat for sexual assault or even murder then, right? Yet somehow, the so-called source, who Dateline claimed to have gotten this evidence from, apparently never informed the authorities about this potential threat. Where is this possible? This never happened. See, the problem is the mainstream media doesn't fact-check when they need to. Now we all know the scenario in which the so-called source informed Dateline about made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But did Dateline question anything? Did they look into any criminal charges of Kohberger once it was revealed it was him? No, they just ran with the allegation and tacked it on with everything else Kohberger is accused of. We have to keep putting pressure on them. We go back to the question, how wasn't Kohberger charged with home invasion if he was identified as the individual who had broken into the home? Who identified Kohberger? Did the friend tell the authorities that perhaps her male friend may have? Oh wait, Dateline claims she didn't call the authorities, right? So how in the fucking hell did anyone identify Kohberger? Let me explain what that was all about. These fuckers are megalomaniacs. They are presenting an incident, subconsciously conditioning the public to believe it happened based on a so-called friend, and of course you know who Kohberger is, so you envision him doing exactly what they claim he did. But the female friend has never been identified, nor was interviewed by Dateline, which they could have simply concealed her identity, to tell the world what happened. But throughout that episode, there were tons of individuals voicing their opinions, from legal analysts, so-called detectives, to even students who Kohberger taught. They even had a guy who was in a class with Kohberger. All of these people had no problem showing their faces, yet the main focus of the episode, of a close friend who had been stalked by Kohberger, was never seen or heard from in that episode. Meaning, that person doesn't exist, they made her up. The only females I'm aware of is the female that went on a date with Kohberger and several female classmates who were interviewed by Dateline. This particular female, though, who had her home allegedly broken into by Kohberger, has never been identified, and I mean never. No social media account that has been researched, no interviews on any mainstream media platform, she's basically an anonymous person. But think about it even deeper. What procedure, or following activity, led to Kohberger being responsible for the home invasion? The home was broken into, the friend notifies Kohberger, surveillance cameras were installed, and then, what? The only way Kohberger would be revealed as the perpetrator, he had to be spotted by that very surveillance, inside her home. And then, what? Surely she would call the authorities, right? But then again, he would do it intentionally, as he would know she'd spot him in the home. Yet, this would make things even more dangerous, so she would have called the authorities. The point, an arrest would be made, which there never was. Do you see how we have to attempt to rationalize something that is irrational? The so-called friend whose home was broken into by Kohberger doesn't exist. If the mainstream media is flat out lying about details, incidents, and activity, how can you trust anything they report? They have lost all credibility, the small element they had to begin with. I mean, this is outrageous, right? Claiming a source had discovered Kohberger had broken into his friend's home, and yet there was no arrest for this criminal activity? There is more suspicious activity coming from the media and so-called sources than the suspect itself. No need to make up prior criminal activity of the suspect, unless you have nothing currently to convict him with. Now it's getting a bit dangerous for the prosecution, as all of this is deemed evidence against the suspect. But none of it exists. This is the chaos sector.